All right. Well, it looks like the trickle has started to slow down. So why don't we get started? Well, welcome everyone. Really excited for the latest installment of our RadTech speaker series. I'm Albert Fox Cahn. I'm the executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or S.T.O.P. We're a New York-based privacy and civil rights group. And we bring you this monthly speaker series in partnership with RadTech, a meetup around technology based here in New York. And really excited for today's session on affect and the algorithm, mental health, and the risks of emotion AI. And we're going to look at the maybe some good, questionable, a lot of bad, and some very ugly uses of emotion AI technology. And I could not be more thrilled for the panel that we have tonight to discuss this. So we have two of the leading experts in the field. So Amelia Vance, who I just found out also goes by America Vance in misprintings of The Guardian, is Vice President of Youth and Education Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. She advises policymakers, academics, companies, and schools on child and student privacy laws and best practices. This year, she co-authored the privacy and equity implications of using self-harm monitoring technologies, recommendations for schools. If you haven't checked it out, please do. It's a really impressive deep dive into the subject matter we're going to be talking about tonight. And we're also joined by Hannah Now I asked you this, and now I'm going to manage to screw it up.
No, that's okay. Hannah Zeavin.
Zeavin. Hannah Zeavin, a lecturer in the departments of English and History at the University of California, Berkeley. She's a faculty affiliate with the Berkeley Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. Hannah's first book, The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, tracks the history of teletherapy, including the surveillance and the weakened ethical standards we've seen in remote and digital therapy. So quite a lot to dig into tonight. And I want to just start off with this basic question for people who might be coming into this conversation with a bit less background. What are we talking about when we talk about emotion AI, when we talk about these sorts of technologies? Because we use different terms for it, but really we're talking about a whole lot of different types of products and types of features. And I was hoping just to get at a high level a breakdown of what you see as the key different products in this space. And happy to start with either of you. Maybe Hannah, since you literally wrote the book on it, we can start with you.
Well, thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've long followed all of your work. Well, so to start, and I think maybe I can be actually low level, and Amelia, you can bring us along, because emotion AI and algorithms for that manage affect or for care have slipped into every conceivable digital interface at this point. But my book focuses on teletherapy, this most obvious site of mental health care and the digital, though the book starts, in 1890. So it has a very long scope to look at this kind of care over distance. So the way I break it down is that mental health care apps really do fall into basically two camps at this point. You have your apps that are hooking you up with a human over distance, but the entire premise is escorted and fronted by various kinds of algorithmic intervention. How you match with that therapist, how they respond to you might be triaged, and so on. And then probably more exciting, maybe also in the negative sense to think about, are the apps that are all bot, all algorithm, which may use a series of trigger words to give a response, are ubiquitously available and almost entirely free. So they're often escorted by this idea about access, which is part of how they get taken up in the public. So really two camps. But as I said, Amelia's work speaks to all kinds of other uses of these technologies as well.
So at a high level, we have on the one hand Uber for therapists, where it's matching you with a
Thank you.
therapist and getting you connected. On the other hand, you have the self-driving car version of Uber, where there's no human involved whatsoever. But Emilio,
Fantastic.
what do these two camps leave out? What are the other creepy dystopian ways we see this sort of technology sort of going from Black Mirror episode to everyday reality?
I feel like that's such a broad question, Albert. Like I could I don't know, give a 300-page dissertation right now on the number of technologies that fit in that category. But limiting it to monitoring here and sort of evaluating someone's mental state. My expertise is mentioned, it is in child and student privacy. So I focus on where privacy issues are raised generally by new technology, where there are new protections proposed in law, proposed in policies that becomes part of platforms of companies, and try and keep an eye on this ever expanding and impossible to hold environment. But one of the things I've been interested in for quite a while now came out of a report that was put out by the Massachusetts ACLU back in 2015. Cade Crockford, who is their director for Technology for Liberty program now, wrote this amazing report with some co-authors on how you had monitoring in school systems just generally to make sure that kids weren't accessing inappropriate material. And sometimes schools were using this not only for that, but also to find out, what websites were being visited. And in one particularly egregious case that is always used as the egregious case, you had a school district where some employee decided it was a good idea to turn on a webcam when a student was home. And the student was in their bedroom, and then penalize them for what was allegedly taking drugs, and the student says were Mike and Ike's. I have so many thoughts, but fortunately we haven't had too many major cases like that. But what we do have is a massive adoption across the US by school districts of monitoring technology. This started out as sort of the anti-porn, thread that we have, for our Puritan culture in the US, and sort of making sure that students weren't getting to inappropriate websites, wouldn't be contacted by strangers, all those fears that we had about the internet in the 90s and 2000s, and then evolved, particularly in the past 5 years, really, to be much broader than that, to create profiles of what students were doing online, what they might be typing online. And of course, at the same time that the monitoring has expanded, the amount that we all use the internet and use devices has expanded. And so you may end up with a reflection of everything that, I don't know about you, but I use Google search when I have random thoughts. And so you may literally end up reading a kid's mind based on, what they might be typing or looking up at any given moment. And so this monitoring might happen on a school device most often. There are a lot of liability issues schools are worried about, and a law that I can talk about later if people are interested. But can also occur on personal devices, depending on whether they're connected to the school network. And this isn't just a school thing. Parents install this software too. And so you have a lot of, different sort of parental monitoring apps. And this is where I will point to the work of, I need to make sure I actually say her last name right, Eva Galperin at EFF, who has done incredible work on apps often that were created for parental monitoring that then end up being used by people to stalk their significant others. And so a lot of reasons why a parent or school may want to make sure that kids aren't accessing information online that is inappropriate, could be harmful to them, but also so much potential for privacy violations.
And it's just amazing when you think about the history of all of this, is that we had seen the whole stranger danger mentality of the 70s and the 80s and early 90s being discredited. People began to know that that was, something that existed as an outsized threat in the public mind, but not a threat in practice. And yet we built all this internet monitoring architecture around the idea that the biggest threat to children was found out there on the dark web, but not where it truly is in most cases, sadly, which is within the home. And so that to me, or within the school itself. And so that, the potential for abuse here is just really terrifying. And I always wonder how many cases like that case that Cahn documented of a student having their webcam turned on, how often that's happened and we just never knew. But all right, before we go fully down that just really nauseating line of possibilities, I want to ask the follow-up question to this: like, if all of this technology is being sold, who's getting rich off of this? Who are the main people selling this sort of technology?
I mean, on the school side or the parent side, I mean, you generally have independent companies. Some of them, it was sort of a natural outgrowth. I mentioned a law and threatened to talk about it. The Children's Internet Protection Act, which was passed around 1999, 2000, required that any school receiving E-rate funding had to filter and monitor their networks. You can imagine what monitoring was in 2002. It was the teacher standing over your shoulder in the computer lab. But 95% of schools, there's, about 14,000 public school districts, 95% of schools receive E-rate funds. E-rate funds are how schools got internet in the first place. Most of the time, it provided phones to schools when it was really expensive to get phone lines to every school, and it now brings in internet. It's essential for schools. And so all of them know that they have this obligation to filter. They have something they have to do related to monitoring, but it's not clear what. And so that becomes difficult. You also have people on the other side who genuinely have these safety concerns and are like, okay, how do I stop X bad thing from happening that maybe happened to me, happened to my family? And then, of course, you have the people who are just like, this is an opportunity for money. This is exciting. But so you have a ton of the companies that started 20 years ago to help with compliance with SIPA, that started out filtering and now have gotten into monitoring. You have some that really started with this idea of sort of monitoring for threats or monitoring for self-harm lens. Those are the more recent companies, particularly as there have been more concerns about school safety. Some of them really started out with this idea of threat detection. In fact, one company that started out of the UK, I think, came out of like searching for terrorists and then started offering their services to schools. And so you really have a wide variety. And then there's the let's give our monitoring software free to schools and try and sell it to parents for parental monitoring option, where you have a few different companies. So lots of variations.
And we're going to definitely get back to some of the questionable predictive models we see being ported into this space. But Hannah, I wanted to turn to you and get a better sense of what the commercial landscape is on the teletherapy side, because it seems like you can't listen to a podcast without getting bombarded with ads. But is it all these new startups? Is there a larger economic backbone to this behind the scenes? What is the lay of the land?
Totally. Thank you. And also, I'm totally happy for us to just drill down, I guess would be the sort of term, on kids. My second book is really in this area. But also in terms of this, we can also add the sort of NGO who also is hosting all kinds of youth specific and even late childhood specific mental health care that is also datafied, that also has really intense consequences. So let's flag that up. Yes, I mean, you named it, right? We have, again, in that, and my colleague Elizabeth Codden calls it the Uberization of therapy. So you have your Uber of therapy, where you are shrinking the profits of practitioners who have been, historically devalued across the 20th and 21st centuries anyway, and increasing their caseloads, and that is the profit motive. So again, escorted by democratization, in reality, cost the user no less than going to see your friendly neighborhood psychotherapist, if there is one in your neighborhood. So that's always the question. And then there's the profit. So yes, of course, we are marketed this as a kind of wellness. And that when we have, Amelia here, we can talk about how these apps skirt both FDA and FTC control. And one of them is by diluting what therapy means. It's for wellness, it's for mental health companionship, and so on. You can just see the kind of squirming out of, the properly mental health and the properly medical, which has good and bad sides as well. I'm not pro medicalization either. Like, just say that and underscore that. For AI apps, of course, the profit is even, the margin is higher because it's on the subscription model usually, or for the one-time download, but there's no human there. So once you've built your product, it's always working towards this idea, starting from the 1960s. We haven't progressed away really, where there's this universalizable, perfect patient subject who is addressable via one script. And the script will do X and Y using its if-thens, but it really presumes one kind of patient. Almost everyone is not that patient, right? Because no universal sort of psyche exists. So that's where the profit happens. And of course, it just leaves users quite vulnerable to it, because we are in a massive crisis, and have been for about a century, of mental health care. We need practitioners. We need an increase in mental health care. It's not forthcoming, but there's the app, and it will present itself time and time again this way.
And that's the thing. We all know there's a desperate need for a solution, for additional resources. I think this is one of the dangers we see with all of these technologies, is the potential for magical thinking, that you don't need structural investments in a long-standing social need. You just need to disrupt. And of course, that disruption tends to have very real costs. So looking at sort of the last 2 years, I can't believe it's been almost a full 2 years, how has the status quo changed during the COVID era, both given the additional isolation, the additional remote work, remote education, all of that, but also the additional funding sources? I'm thinking specifically of CARES Act funding potentially going towards additional surveillance in the school setting.
So it's probably changed a lot less than you'd think, but the reason is because it already existed prior to the pandemic. I mean, this software was not new in any way, because you did have that, feeling of needing to be legally compliant from schools. And so the vast majority of them, especially by the time you hit 2018, you had the Parkland tragedy, you had schools desperate to have red flags, just a mass run on anything that promised that they could detect things and help, and have some of that often magical thinking related to that. And so by the time we hit the pandemic, you didn't necessarily have that many people adopting new tech, though there was definitely growth of monitoring software in the same way there was growth of every other type of education technology. But you did have just an additional legal and ethical messy layer of, now we're not only monitoring our school device, which, legally the school has full rights to do. There's liability issues if they don't. It gets really messy because there's also major equity interests on the other side of that for kids who can afford a device and can't. But everybody's at home, but school is happening at home. And so suddenly, not to go down too much of a lawyer rabbit hole, suddenly we are intruding into the seclusion of the home. And what does this mean? We're dealing with interesting Fourth Amendment questions, even beyond what we'd faced prior to the pandemic, where there was monitoring happening after hours. But is there an interest? Is it reasonable for schools to do this? And yes, some parents 100% want there to be monitoring. They're like, yes, I cannot keep up with what my kid does. Please, somebody do it. And would also sue the school if they didn't do it and didn't catch, their child being cyberbullied or accessing whatever YouTube video, whatever it is. But you also had a lot of parents who looked at this and were like, I would not like my child to be watched while we're in our home and have their search history and everything else, brought over to the school in the same way that a lot of parents were like, wow, there's a lot more tech that my children are using than I realized as there was, homeschooling during the pandemic. And so I think you really saw a heightened level of awareness as opposed to heightened adoption of monitoring software in many cases, and a heightening of the conversation because it did feel so intrusive when all of the monitoring was suddenly happening while kids were at home.
I mean, this may be too legally nerdy a line to go down, but it strikes me that it's kind of amazing that in 60 years you go from Tinker v. Iowa for these court rulings that are saying, well, the Constitution doesn't end at the schoolhouse gate, to then having these questions about whether essentially any rights exist in your own bedroom simply because you're in the virtual school. And it really feels like we have massively shifted the reach of the school and the power of the school without having a debate or a thorough legal analysis of any of that.
I mean, the bad news for advocates on this side, good news for those who really do genuinely believe this is the right way to do this. Because I should be careful. There are some clear cut, and every single school administrator I have talked to has at least two anecdotes of there was a kid who typed how to tie a noose and we caught them before. So there are situations, and every single person has said that they have had something exactly like that. But it's often, a couple of kids. What are the other things it's collecting? What do you have mental health wise that's being collected? What do you have kids not looking at because they know the school is, monitoring and going to call them into the principal's office, if they type, why do I feel sad? And so there's a lot of issues there. But I will go nerdery for nerdery with you, Albert, because anyone who really wants to go into this, you should look at, what is it? I still don't know how to say it right. I think it's the Mahanoy case, because it was not how I thought it was said. And that came out from the Supreme Court this year, because if you apply, I mean, it's a First Amendment case. And so anything I say about the Fourth Amendment is just dicta, but they basically said the school has the absolute right. If it's the school's device related to schoolwork, school can do whatever it wants. Fascinatingly, I think it was Alito's, I think it was a concurrence that has a footnote citing the Pennsylvania webcam case that says, even though the majority says that there are not necessarily limits here, see this case where I think the majority would find that there should be a limit. And so you actually, at least at the moment, don't have public opinion from judges that this is inappropriate or out of bounds, even while I think society as a whole really finds it offensive and out of bounds, because when you have reports like that one from the Massachusetts ACLU come out, I think within a year of it coming out and being publicized, almost every single school district that they talked about, the major monitoring company that they talked about, had changed their policies, disabled the creepier aspects of tracking, like added notifications to parents. And yeah, I just think society and the law are, as always with tech, in very different places.
Well, nothing like looking at judicial opinions to make you skeptical about our ability to fix any of this. But
it's a footnote. It's even more fun. But
while
always read the footnotes.
Yes, the footnotes always pay off. But while we're talking about limitations, Hannah, I wanted to talk about some of the limitations of the technology, and just thinking about, one of the points you started to discuss earlier about trying to create this idea that you can predict people's mental health, categorize people's mental health in these very rudimentary ways. And it seems like not only is that set up to fail for a large number of patients, but it seems like it's designed to fail for the patients with the most acute needs and the most complex cases, because they are going to it seems unlikely that they would map onto this model of what the perfect patient looks like.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I mean, so I think this has been, that's why it's an ever elusive quest, and that's the story I tell in the 4th chapter of my book, right? Why we still want the AI therapist and why it's been impossible. And, starting in the 1960s, we have the late, which we are still really living out, though it sounds like it's a really long time ago, which it is. We in the US case, right, there's the shift from kind of the asylum across the first half of the 20th century into the community, which is finally really, truly, fully taken place by the 1960s, except none of the funding, none of the structures are in place to accommodate that change. So many scholars will talk about how this interrelates to mass incarceration, right, while also being careful to say, the prison is not the new asylum. It's a different situation, but that they're interrelated forces. We have all kinds of fallout from this. And one is this very techno-optimistic, magical thinking that comes out from the 1960s at Stanford, which is like, we can just program a bot to do it. And okay, the technology isn't quite there in the 1960s. By the way, it's also not quite there now. But it is that idea, like if we just get one bot, it will take care of the scale problem. And we have only, to quote Wendy Chun, we have updated to remain the same, right? We are still working with that paradigm from the 1960s in essence now, but at even greater scale. And so the things generally don't work very well. If you grew up, I'm a mid-millennial, but if you're Gen X and you grew up playing with Eliza, you might have a sense of like how quickly these things can break down. They can be very frustrating. They can be alienating, but they're packaged in a very cute kind of frictionless way to entrain the user to come back again and again. This is the gamification of mental health care. In the absence of a relationship, you need something that makes you want to show up for your session. And it's all about kind of enjoyability and pleasure. And meanwhile, the technology is really low grade. It's really a conversational agent that is meant to make you feel better for catharsis. Behind all of that is where things are scary, right? That just sounds useless, but people are paying $4 for it. Like, not great, but no tragedy. The tragedy has to do with what's being collected. The fact that, yes, same as with schools, right? There are just, it's every quarter. There's a horrific story of some massive leak and breach, either that is human error, but at scale because the human has access to much more, or is a true kind of hack. People's really sensitive, right? It's mental health specific. It's people's most sensitive data, not even a complete picture, just that one thing. There was a horrific case this summer And that's the byproduct, right? And there are plenty of apps that don't even know why they're collecting that data, except we know that data equals a kind of profit. And so they're kick that question down the road. And again, that's both on the Uber and on the self-driving car side, because both are using algorithms, even if there's a human face present.
And we know from just analyzing technology generally that when these systems fail, they fail in particularly problematic ways for certain communities and tend to replicate the inequities in our society more generally. So could you talk a bit about the ableism, the racial discrimination, all of the forms of bias that end up getting baked in to these different platforms?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so of course we I think are living in a moment where, thanks to groundbreaking work of all kinds of scholars and advocates, we as a general public know more, I hope, that there is all of these kinds of bias baked in. And then specifically in the mental health space, so like, yes, that is true with all kinds of code. So in digital health and medicine, right, there is endless medical redlining where a white patient will be X times more likely to be granted an ER bed at first blush, right? That they're, without any checkout. And that because of ER wait times, this is going to massively affect the health of the most vulnerable communities, again, remediated at scale. With mental health, the place I've been putting the most pressure is to think about how this operates, and also just for our sake, because we have Amelia here, with suicide hotlines and their remediation. Because it's not just the technology, it's also how the technology operates in a society. So of course the techno optimist idea is just add technology, like add water, and a new hope spring eternal will come. We also see that then we think of these systems in a vacuum. So as an example, suicide hotlines, which are datafied, increasingly used to be really radical. They were set up in the 50s as a space away from the carceral, away from policing, and importantly, away from the homophobia of psychiatry, right? Where homosexuality, so-called, was still in the DSM-3. And over time, they've been recuperating, of course, psychiatry and expert mental health listening, but also re-entrenching their relationships with policing. So this is, again, actually, it's a very intense area. But when Amelia is talking about the school case where they'll say, but we caught a student in time. So escorted by that notion of suicide intervention, right, where they're intervening on a student, rather than caring for the student leading up till that moment. We see this also with suicide hotlines, where in fact, 100 times a day, the police will be called to do a quote unquote wellness check because of an algorithmic set of trigger words, where a human doesn't even have to place that call. And of course, and this I really hope we all know, the effects of policing in communities is deeply uneven. And of course, these wellness checks every single year turn lethal. In terms of race, of course, and class, but also neurodiversity. And when someone is in that moment, they've made that outreach call, they very well may be armed, right? Not, of course, to hurt anyone else. And so that's one of these places where we see affect in AI using trigger words come into a system that already exists, right? The carceral and policing and police violence, and continue to, entrench that system even further in a place where we think AI for good. And I think these are the kinds of places I'm in my scholarship trying to have us slow down and really look at these effects beyond just, again, that kind of AI for good tagline.
And Amelia, I'd love your thoughts on these same questions of bias, these same questions of discrimination. But I also want to pause just because, look, we're talking about very serious subjects. We know that this has been a very trying time for so many people. And I just wanted to pause and offer resources for anyone who is in crisis, but recognizing the limitations of those existing mental health resources, I wanted to ask each of you if you have any specific recommendations if people are in need. Of course, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 800-273-8255. But as we're discussing, all of these different platforms have their own trade-offs. Are there other resources that each of you can point to that for anyone who is in crisis?
I mean, certainly the Trevor Project is always high on my list, though. Hannah, you and I will have to talk offline because they've actually added a chatbot, I think, recently, and I'm very curious what you think.
Yeah, I was speaking with them as they were doing that.
Yeah, very nice. But yeah, and an interesting aspect of this is there may sort of be more access for people. But again, it's like going back to what Hannah said, I think I was just reading my insurance paperwork for next year yesterday, and it's something like they're now supporting getting access to therapy via 7-Cups, which is one of the therapy apps out there, which I'd never seen before in any, health paperwork. And so it's one of those things where you're like, okay, is this better than nothing? If you can't afford a therapist, if you're in an area without therapy, will this work? Will creating community work? But I think from everything I have heard, the hotlines are best bet.
And I just, for those of you who are seeing the stream elsewhere and can't see the chat, I wanted to plug that Hannah mentioned the Trans Lifeline at translifeline.org as another resource.
And I'm going to just keep putting resources in the chat for a minute, because it's always good to do, irrespective of what we're talking about, because help is so hard to find, which is why, of course, people feel the need to seek out care wherever they can, even when care is really not care at all. So there are many different places you can find therapists who aren't part of these kinds of systems, who are outside. And I will just also back Amelia that hotlines for a really long time have remained an incredibly important source of care, not just when people are in crisis, but actually when they're feeling down or they need a place to talk that's safe. And you can always just check out the terms of service of the hotline. They have to tell you what they're going to do. Trans Lifeline always keeps everything internal, as do many others as well.
And we'll make sure to post those resources with the YouTube recording of this as well, and on our website for others to review. But sorry, I know that's an abrupt transition, but we always want to recognize the reality of these conversations. And Amelia, just turning back to the question around bias, around discrimination and how these platforms operate. What are some of the patterns that you've seen in your work?
So the first I mentioned earlier, which is really this: who has a device that it makes sense to monitor. So the school owns a device, your employer owns a device. There's generally going to be some sort of agreement that says, if you use this device, you have to allow us access for liability, et cetera, et cetera. And so the primary people who are going to use that device for everything are either me, who just, fails at switching devices when I should, or are people who can't afford another device. And this applies so much during the pandemic. Suddenly, the device you might have from school is the only way that you could communicate with other kids, with your grandparents, with anyone outside of the home. And so that means that that's the data that is overwhelmingly being scanned. And that means that when something is flagged, it's probably flagged behavior from a student who's using that device because they don't have another device to use, versus because that student versus another student is doing something problematic or abnormal or whatever it may be deemed as. So you have massive equity issues there that, of course, link back to the fact that we have massive equities when it comes to wealth distribution in the US. And so that hits a lot of marginalized populations across the board. You have trouble with AI and languages other than English generally. So one of the biggest things that can cause issues here is both, how well AI deals with other languages and also slang. So I'm trying to remember, we included in the report one person on my team who then ran for school board and is off being awesome now in California, Jasmine Park, talked about there's a phrase used in K-pop dramas that's something like, I don't know, use the words kill or die or something. And this is basically like it doesn't even matter, or just some sort of phrase. But of course, that's going to get flagged. Of course, that is going to end up showing up on these systems. And so you have certain phrases that show up in different cultural contexts that are flagged, even though they have nothing to do with what is being monitored for. So all sorts of issues with that. And then, of course, the stigma around mental health, the assumption that mental health concerns equal threat, equal violence. You have some companies that explicitly make that connection on their website, where it's like, let's point this out to avoid threats. And sometimes it's done in a genuine sense of threats to self or others. But oftentimes it just further stigmatizes those with, mental health issues. But that's an unfortunate trend we've seen well beyond this space from, legislators and others, as we've had the continued spate of gun violence here. And so when we're looking at mental health issues, unfortunately, it may also be in a way contributing to that stigma, because we're not just seeing if you're okay, we're making sure that you're not going to hurt anyone else. And if that's the assumption, if that's the myth that's pushed forward, that means when you are flagged, that might get serious. And the goal is not to help you. The goal is to make sure you don't hurt other people.
And I think it's worth emphasizing for the audience that the individuals who have mental health issues, individuals, even those going through mental health crisis, overwhelmingly will never pose a threat to anyone except in some cases themselves. And that really this creation of the myth of mental health, having mental health needs as being a proxy for somehow being violent or being a threat, this has been disproven time and time again. This is completely unfounded, and it really is something that needs to go by the wayside.
I would point to the Bazelon Center for Mental Health and National Disability Rights Network. They've been doing an amazing amount of writing and stuff as we've had this myth come up again and again and again. If you want to learn more about that.
And also because I can be the historian on the panel, if I were to say, if you were to read one book that shows just how deeply entrenched, especially racial biases in terms of this history of psychiatry, where that flip happens, where a kind of crisis means automatically violence, I heartily recommend, and it's written for a big audience, The Protest Psychosis by Jonathan Metzl, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, which just shows that within psychiatry, there's a massive flip for the understanding of this, question in mid-century, and it's a really, really powerful read. And it blows open these questions just about in every field and in every case.
Well, I know we only have 15 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we have some time for questions from the audience, and you can submit those using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I would love to know what you're thinking about all of these issues. Have you encountered this software? Is this something that you see being used in your company and your child's school? Is it something you've signed up for? And just really what concerns are most top of mind for you. I want to ask a question about sort of the users of this, because I think of there being a very different model when this is something being used by an institution to monitor a group of individuals versus when it's an individual using it to evaluate themselves or try to get help for themselves. And so maybe we can go a bit into sort of the differences in how the same technology used by different types of users can have very different impacts. And so whether it's in the in combination with the criminal justice system, whether it's in specifically a school disciplinary setting, whether it's in a traditional mental health setting, or whether it's in an app that's trying to provide some alternative to traditional care, what are the different risks for when you see this same tech being used in these different ways?
So hilariously, I guess, I actually feel much better about the institutional use because it's at least kind of regulated. There's, these unlike, some ed tech, which, could just be picked up and adopted by a teacher trying to find, a new way to get students excited about math, that sort of thing. These companies usually have specific contracts with schools. They've actually had a really good history of not having massive security problems, unlike parental monitoring software. They tend to have detailed contracts and a deep understanding of how they need to comply with the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and there's been about 130 state student privacy laws passed, including about 30 states that have laws specifically targeting vendors. And so you do have some legal protections here. The major issues are that doesn't cover how the school uses the information, how it may be used to stigmatize, how it may be used not to help, but in an effort to protect other students by getting rid of the troublesome student. And so I would prefer if we had to pick which of these to ban, the school side of monitoring or, sort of the interesting, types of apps that Hannah works on that, I've downloaded in the past and been like, I don't actually have a privacy policy. And then got a message back on LinkedIn being like, ooh, could you give me advice on how to write that? Where there's just literally it's people reaching out for help with probably 0%, laws that have to be followed or like some initial something to protect consumers. But that's just me.
Yeah.
Hannah, please go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to add that also, just to like really underscore this, it's exactly right. I mean, I can't pick which is the greater evil. They're really different. They're operating very perniciously, both. But if we leave that question aside, I think it's important to underscore it's the person who's in crisis, whether that's an extreme crisis or the ordinary crisis that living under capitalists, let alone in a global pandemic, right? Living in our political system, who wants help. And they can't afford or can't make use of, which are two different things and deeply interrelated, other forms of traditional care. So they're turning to these apps. Now, this entire classification of app, only 1% of them, and there are thousands, can back up any of its efficacy claims. So it's a kind of whatever that is a charlatan cure from the early 1900s represents to digitally. Again, it might be fun, it might be distracting. I'm not saying it has zero benefit, but then the lack of oversight is essentially total, as Amelia is pointing out. So neither the FTC nor the FDA, though both are going to try, are regulating these objects. At the same time, as in earlier, Albert, you asked what's up with the pandemic itself and how has that impacted? Crucially, so very different from Amelia's case, HIPAA was waived at the start of pandemic. So in terms of medical grade software, et cetera, this stopped being a going concern. Yes, you can now use FaceTime to call your therapist. So there are even fewer protections and restrictions on the kind of data that are being gathered here as well. And so all taken together, it is a pretty bleak picture, right? You're paying for something that doesn't work, that is going to minimum gather really sensitive data, if not worst case, leak it, let alone the other kinds of things that I was talking about earlier.
And I get to now use my favorite expression of recent years, which is Silicon Valley snake oil, which I think really captures a lot of the tech we see. But to play devil's advocate a bit, Amelia, I wanted to push back and say, I completely agree with your analysis of the lack of privacy policies, the additional regulation, but it seems like the errors are much more meaningful in the institutional context sometimes, because when the user apps get it wrong, it can be frustrating. There can be real consequences, but it seems like it's much more significant when a SWAT team is showing up at your door because a predictive model has said that you're about to commit an act of violence simply because of, a racist training set of search terms that was fed into the model. So isn't there sort of a disparity in sort of those worst case scenarios between the institutional actors and the individual apps?
I'm going to be a lawyer and say, it depends. So honestly, the thing that I personally worry about, having been one of those people who downloads a bunch of the apps to be like, is one of these useful? Is at some point, the data you enter into those apps is sold, is passed on, and you don't know when it shows up in your future. And honestly, that scares me a lot more than anything else. But I'm fairly privileged white cis female. So, that's my personal fear. When it comes to the monitoring in schools, yes, you might have those worst case scenarios, but you actually have this. I've been asked a few times by congressional staffers about, this software and, black box AI. This is actually one of the few forms of AI where most of the companies, I'd say probably all of them that I know of, actually try to make sure it's a transparent box, often to the detriment of privacy, because they literally have every reason why they gave the flag. So some of the more interesting ones that used to be used for terrorists provide like 15 minutes of history of what you were browsing and what you were doing, what set off the flag, and then the 15 minutes after that. And so you have a whole history of why they flagged someone. You also have the history of all of the flags that happened previously. And so why someone is flagged. You can investigate it. It doesn't mean that the bias goes away because you're still getting more flags in a biased manner. But you have a better likelihood of being able to have that nuance. But it's bad. Like I've heard stories too of, mistakes that occur. The most common chat app for kids is actually like Google Docs because it's not banned in schools. And so obviously like the schools scan the school's Google Docs. And so you had a situation where a student who I think their parents were either recent immigrants or undocumented, was in the house with her grandmother on like a Friday night. Something was flagged by software that seemed like, some sort of call for help, self-harm, something that was urgent. The district called up law enforcement because they couldn't get a hold of anyone, came and showed up. The grandmother is terrified because, doesn't speak a lot of English. There's like police at the door. And she had no idea that her grandkid wasn't upstairs sleeping, but instead on the computer. And as it turned out, it wasn't her granddaughter who'd written the thing in the doc. It was another kid who was chatting. And so the good news ish is the district took that as a, oh crap, we better have a policy and actually ended up making sure that they had like all of those specific, like, did we double check who it was from? Did we verify it's a big thing? Like the whole list. But too many districts, I think, have adopted this tech without thinking through those things. And so you have those events and then people being like, oh crap, let's create a policy for the technology we adopted.
And I
Oh
think
my.
yeah, I mean, that's a horrible story, but I also think that so again, if we can, what is worse is I mean, it's all very, very bad, but um, it's also the same problem, which is that instead of investing in mental health care for students, instead of, restricting guns in this country, instead of doing these things that are structural, expensive, impossible because of how the country is functioning and set up, just add tech. And then lots is going to go wrong, right? So it would go wrong if it was the teacher standing over the shoulder, right? But it's remediated at scale. That's part of the problem. The teacher standing over the shoulder may have the same or worse biases, right? But I think we see very similarly also in the mental health care, quote unquote, space, the Silicon Valley snake oil, right? Escorted by all of the problems of mental health care and access, which are deeply entrenched. Instead of redressing wholesale that, we have these tiny like app band-aids that constellate into this other problem. So I think we can also just be tracing what's happening in, monitoring affect. Well, there are so many other kinds of affect AI we haven't even begun to talk about, but beyond this. So like we've really worked out 2 case studies, but there's going to be similar parallels elsewhere as well.
And I think it's going to also be seen quite a bit in, the national security space, like Amelia was talking about. I've seen, I've represented a lot of people who had SWAT teams or FBI agents at their door because of really racist, Islamophobic, apps that were telling people that this person was a risk. So that is a whole other conversation, unfortunately. I want to make sure we get in time for our first question, which is from M, which is about the prevalence of faux AI, pseudo AI, tech that pretends to be AI, but really is just masking a whole lot of human labor, which quite frankly is the majority of purported AI. Are there specific cases of firms working with mental health AI or filtering where that sort of Potemkin artificial intelligence is used?
So it's funny in education, that's actually, it's never really considered pseudo AI. It's a feature more and more, and it's also often sold as a privacy protective feature, which may be. So the idea of there's a human who looks at this before someone is called, double checks that the alert isn't just a red flag. You have many of the monitoring companies that have the automatic flag, which is usually just like scanning words, some sort of proprietary algorithm. And then you have humans who look at it, say, yes, this is an urgent flag, and then it goes to the school. And we've seen more and more of that as there has been criticism of monitoring on the grounds that it lacks efficacy. So you maybe are solving at least some of the problems over here, but one of the open questions is really, what is the training of that human looking at some very sensitive things with their own sets of biases? What is the training that is faced there? And could speak another hour about that.
Yeah, similarly, this is such an amazing question, because it's both this way that Amelia is describing, but also the other way, where there are humans again who are there either to give people some reassurance, or in the Potemkin version, but where in either case in the mental health care scenario, they feel completely subordinate to the algorithm. It's very hard to override. So you might have all the expertise. You may indeed be a social worker, and you're running one of these scripts and you can't intervene, you can't interfere, which is a really terrible experience in terms of labor. But yet you're giving this reassurance to your user that there's also a human always watching you. On the other hand, of course, no matter what kind of technical system, there are humans involved, right? And so we've seen that from the kind of move to calling it a cloud, that the materiality is always being tamped down and blocked and moved to the side. And so I think, like with Amelia, I have very similar concerns, including for the workers, right, who are part of these systems. And yeah, that's perfect thing to drop in the chat. Thank you.
All too often, it seems that a human in the loop can actually transform to a human being just being run over by the wheel of automation, and that it becomes this thing where they don't have real agency. But we're almost out of time. But before we end, I wanted to just ask you quickly, what's something that gives you hope that we can actually improve this situation? Because we've highlighted a lot of the dangers here. We've highlighted a lot of what's going wrong. But what are, just in 30 seconds, what is one thing, one fleeting thing that makes you hope that this situation can get better?
Advocates, radical technologists, of whom there are a few, lawyers, and also, as always in the history of mental health care, users themselves, patients themselves, standing up for what they need.
Every time that these systems sort of are put in front of communities, when people are made aware of them, there are improvements made, bringing attention to the fact that this monitoring exists, that it is a thing, and the extent of it causes change. And depending on the community, sometimes that's have no monitoring, please. Sometimes it's, yes, school, we'd like you to monitor because we want to know what our kids are doing too. But the transparency matters, that shining a light on the fact that it is happening in the first place matters a lot. And so that gives me a lot of hope here.
Well, Amelia, Hannah, thank you so much. I feel like we could have talked about this for another hour. We could have talked about this for days, but we'll have to sadly end it here. But thank you so much. Thank you all for tuning in for our last RadTech session of the year, and looking forward to reconvening this series next year, and hope you all have a safe and happy start to your 2022. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you.